All right, at this point you should have downloaded or cloned the gallery repository, and that will give you a directory structure that looks something like this. We should have a README file in Markdown, a server.js file, and an images folder that's been preloaded with a few images. If we actually open that with an editor and take a look at what that looks like, our server.js file is currently basically an empty file with a little bit of comments, and our README file explains what this application is for, as well as where we got our images. Those were downloaded from Pixabay, and they are in the public domain. So the next step is we want to go ahead and build a web server. So a web server that will respond to requests from a client with a response. And that response will be one of these images. We want to actually send back an image. To get us started, we're going to jump back to the server.js. This is where we're actually going to write our code. And we'll start with the use strict statement. Now, if we look at this, this is just a string. It's what we would call a no-op in computer science because it's not going to actually make any changes to code. It's not going to affect our memory or anything like that. It's just a string that will be thrown away. However, it serves as an important flag to the JavaScript V8 engine that Node is built to use, and that tells the V8 engine that we want it to use a strict interpretation of JavaScript rules. So it's going to be less fudgy about how things work. And at the same time, that also lets JavaScript know that we want to use some of the latest ECMA 5 and 6 structures that aren't part of the current JavaScript standard. So working from there, we want to actually create an HTTP server, which is going to listen on a port on this computer. And in order to do this in JavaScript, we'll actually have to leverage a library that comes packaged with Node, and that's the HTTP library. So I'm going to bind that to a variable, and I'm going to require it with a require statement. Now, require statements are pretty much unique to Node, although there are a few JavaScript browser libraries that emulate the functionality. But it's a way that Node, the developers of Node came up with to modularize code. So we can build libraries, we can require them, which is similar in concept to importing or including in other languages. And so the contents of this library or this code module get bound to the HTTP variable. Now, the HTTP library has a couple functions for creating HTTP clients and HTTP servers. We're going to use one of those now. We want to create a HTTP server, and we do that with the HTTP create server function call. We're going to bind the result, and that result is going to be an actual server, an HTTP server, to the variable server. Then we need to provide an argument to create server, and what the argument it's expecting is a function that takes a request object and a response object and returns, or actually uses that and sends a response. So it's going to look at what request object is and send a response. This is the heart of our web server. I'm going to go ahead and set this up to response.end, and I'm just going to pass the string OK into that. So what we've done, create server, when this server actually becomes created, it's going to listen for incoming requests, and it's going to wrap those in an incoming request object, which exposes a lot of the fields of that. And it's also going to send us a response object, which allows us to build and eventually send a response back to our client. The response.end method says we're done building our response, and we can optionally pass in a body, and this could be binary data, this could be, like it is in this case, a string that's going to be sent back to our client. And the last step we need to do is we need to tell our server to listen on a particular port. Now, normally we'd be listening on port 80. That's what the standard HTTP port is. But since we're in development mode, we're going to actually use a different port. And I'm going to actually assign that to another variable. And let's just use port 2000 for right now. So I'll pass that argument in. We can also provide a second argument, a callback function to the listen argument. And that's basically a function we want to have called after the server has started to listen. And I like to use this to just log a message to the console telling me that the server is up and running. and what port it's listening on. And that way I don't have to remember exactly what port I set it up for. It will show up in my messages. So I can give this a try. If I jump back over to the terminal, I need to be in the same directory as my gallery code. And you can see it there, I'm in the gallery directory. And I'm going to call node, which is the node executable. And I'm going to pass as a command line argument server.js. That's the file we're just writing. So what we're telling node is start the JavaScript V8 interpreter and load the contents of this file into that interpreter environment. So as that file gets loaded, it's going to parse this file. It's going to see that we're using the strict mode and that we want to require the HTTP library, and that's going to be bound to this HTTP variable, that we're going to bind the value 2000 to our port, that we're going to create a server and bind that to the server variable, and finally that we're telling that server to begin listening at port 2000, and finally logging that response. So let's give this a try. So we're listening, and you can see our message just popped up, listening on port 2000. So if I come to localhost, which just says, localhost is what we call a loopback address. It says I want to talk to or listen to this local computer. My local computer is the host. And we're going to port 2000, and you can see we get the message, okay. So that is exactly what we sent. So that was step one for creating a simple server.